I'd like to ask you guys a question today. Do you know about all the different debuffs and buffs in Destiny 2? You do? Alright, well, let's just pretend then. A few weeks back, I did a video covering the different interactions between Tether, Tractor Cannon, and Divinity, and from my point of view, it was a success. Some learned something new, others learned about certain interactions that they didn't know about. It was great. So today, I'd like to go over a proper damage guide for players who are not hardcore endgame or are speedrunners. In particular, I'd like to cover lesser known or completely slept on debuffs and buffs that you could be utilizing in Destiny to optimize your damage. Now you might be asking, is this information actually important? And that would be an absolute yes. The main reasoning for this is while general meta setups for optimizing damage rarely change, think Tether or Divinity, the playstyle versus certain bosses and enemy types do, and we get new ones all the time. For example, a boss like Keitel from the Duality Dungeon does not require the use of Divinity at all, because Keitel quite literally just stands still for you. Meanwhile, bosses such as Rulk, who are extremely mobile, have a slim body type, and have very small crits that you can hit, might require you to pull out a Divinity just for a strategy to adapt to make your life easier as a fire team. With that said, let's get into the chaos. I'll be covering debuffs first and then buffs, and also trying to give some scenarios or examples of why something could or should be used. First up, we have global debuffs. Global debuffs are the highest possible debuff percentage you can get in the game currently and do not stack with each other, specifically when talking about the numbers, but not detailed interactions. The current global debuffs in Destiny 2 are Shadow Shot, which is Night Stalker Tether, Tractor Cannon, and then a much lesser known Felwinter's Helm. All three of these clock in as 30% debuffs applied to enemies, the highest amount allowed in the game currently. Now Tether and Tractor Cannon are pretty well known, so I won't bore you with that, but I would, however, like to talk about Felwinter's Helm for a second. For those unaware, Felwinter's Helm is a Warlock helmet with the following effect. Powered melee final blows create a burst of energy that weakens targets nearby. Finishers and final blows against more powerful combatants increase the radius of the burst and the length of the weakening effect. Now, in case you're curious about the durations, the radius goes from 10 to 15 to 20 to 25 meters. Then the duration is 5 to 10 to 15 to 20 seconds, and the finisher duration is 10 to 15 to 20 seconds. Now, the 25 seconds you might as well just ignore because that's based on bosses, and you wouldn't apply this to bosses because you're probably trying to fight the boss, not kill the boss with Felwinters. So you're looking at, let's say, finishing a champion or just a yellow bar enemy, such as at Ektar, then that would be a 15-second debuff applied globally, including to the boss. And then if you're doing a orange bar, it'll be 10 seconds, and then a red bar would be 5 seconds. So Felwinter's is a bit of a situational exotic that can't be used in every scenario, but it does have its place in the game for being helpful. For example, I utilize Felwinter's Helm to combine with my Arc Warlock with Legend of Acreus in order to one-face Keitel solo. I didn't need Tractor Cannon or Tether because I already had my 30% debuff. On the flip side, for team play, it can be very useful in places like the first boss of Ghost of the Deep in Ekthar. During the damage phase, a Yellow Bar Knight will spawn in that you need to down to get the buff to break his shield, which means you can finish this enemy to apply the 30% debuff to the boss with the maximum timer, and this allows you to have a 30% debuff on him while not forcing anybody to be on Tractor Cannon or Tether and letting all three players utilize their heavy weapon and offensive supers if they'd like. Now let's chime in with the lower level weaken debuffs. The rest of these are 15% weaken effects that can be overwritten by a higher debuff like the ones I just mentioned before. And now Divinity and weaken grenades via Echo of Undermining, most of you have probably already heard of, so let's throw some others out there that you might have no clue about. We've got an artifact this season, in Season of the Witch, called Rapid Fire Ranger, that gives you a 15% weaken off of rapid precision hits. We have Heart Shadow that weakens upon hits when invisible. You have Snare Bomb from Night Stalkers that can weaken targets thanks to Stylish Executioner. Chromatic Fire and Second Chance Gloves can both weaken targets. And Collective Obligation also can weaken if used right. Finally, possibly the best one for last, Child of the Old Gods via Void Warlock can weaken targets and keep this up for the duration of its effect. I'll explain why this is great shortly. But before that, and before we move on from debuffs, there is one more thing I do want to cover and mention with global debuffs. For the sake of the argument, let's call them Tier 2 debuffs. Now, these Tier 2 debuffs cannot be overwritten, but they can be extended by weaken effects, which are Tier 1 in this case. What is a weaken effect? It's an effect that comes from an ability such as, you guessed it, Child of the Old Gods, or even just weaken grenades in this case. Although this does not apply to Tether for some reason. Don't know why. Maybe it's because it's a separate, anchor from your abilities. Anyway, I'm rambling off. Now, why is this important? Well, if you take a global debuff, such as Tractor Cannon or Felwinter's, then apply it to a boss enemy, and then throw out Child of the Old Gods with a few seconds remaining on, say, your tractor cannon, then Child of the Old Gods will then reset the timer of the global debuff, meaning your 15% weaken effect is actually pumping and resetting the 30% debuff instead for the duration of your ability. And then some of you may ask, well, that's cool, but can I also do this with my grenade once Child of the Old Gods is running out? And the answer is yes. That would also work in extending your timer. So essentially, you could fire one single tractor cannon shot, swap to a damage heavy, and then have that debuff up for the entire duration of the damage phase for a boss, like Iryut, for example, that lasts 40 seconds, without worrying about having to refresh tractor every 10 seconds. Okay, that was a mouthful. Let's move on to things that buff your damage itself. These are mods, abilities, or even some specific exotics that bump up your damage rather than weakening the enemy, meaning you combine your buffs with a debuff for optimized damage. These also work on a tier system from tier 1 to tier 4, so let's begin at the very bottom with the easiest one people know, weapon surges. Your boots can equip 1 to 3 weapon surges of any affinity. Depending on how many you have equipped, you will get a percentage of extra damage. One mod will give you 10%, which is tier 1, 2 mods will give you 17%, which is tier 2, and then 3 mods will give you a whopping 22%, which is tier 3. Now, some exotics can also provide the same benefits, including pushing your damage over to a tier 4, which is 25%. For example, Sanguine Alchemy can provide a tier 2 damage buff of 17%. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Sanguine can allow you to take advantage of having 2 different surges to have your damage get buffed. For example, you can have a Solar Warlock with Sanguine to give your solar weapons a 17% damage buff. Meanwhile, you use a different affinity in your boots to give you a 22% damage buff to that weapon type. In other words, you can combine Solar plus Void, Void plus Arc, etc. You get the idea. These next few exotics can give you a damage buff from tier 1 to tier 4 depending on kills. These are Doomfang Pauldrons, Path of the Burning Steps, Icefall Mantle, and Eternal Warrior. Next, these exotics can give you a tier 4 damage buff for 25% specifically. These are Foe Tracer, Raiju's Harness, Mask of Baccharis, and Mantle of Battle Harmony. Now, a question you might have is, can I stack my Surge mods in my boots with one of these exotics? And the answer is no. They do not stack together to give you a higher amount, though the highest achieved tier will always take priority, meaning if you try to use 3 Surge mods while also using Foe Tracer would take priority as it's a tier 4 and is a higher percentage at 25%. These next 4 exotics are buffs that are independent from weapon surges and work on a different tier system that falls in with damage buff abilities. These exotics are Boots of the Assembler, Gerfalcon's Halberd, No Backup Plans, and Lumina. All of these can provide a 35% damage buff and are considered tier 3. As for the other tiers, let's take it from the bottom. For tier 1, you have Empowering Rip, which is a flat 20% damage buff. Then comes tier 2 at 25%. This tier includes Well of Radiance, Ward of Dawn, aka Titan Bubble, and radiant effects such as Celestial Fire, Bonk Hammer, Throwing Knives, etc. Tier 3, we already discussed, talking about the exotics. And lastly, tier 4 is one ability all by itself, and that is Titan Banner Shield. It's a damn shame there's a different Titan banner that gets abused instead, though. But in any case, Banner Shield in this scenario is a 40% damage buff, but then you have a player taken out of the equation if you're using Banner Shield, which is why it's not used very much. These, much like weapon surge buffs, do not stack together, but instead go off of what is the highest priority. So this example, let's say you have an Empowering Rift, which gives you a 20% buff. If you pop Well of Radiance on top of it, your damage buff is now going to be 25%, as well as the higher buff. You will not get a 45% damage buff. That'd be really silly. Lastly, there are a few rogue exotics out there that will break all the rules and just ignore all logic and stack with just about everything. And an example, this would be things like Sithoceps for Titans or Wrathweavers for Warlocks. Now that we've discussed both debuffs and buffs, I'd like to take a minute to talk about scenarios where you can take advantage of some of these lesser-known methods. But first, Sneak from the future here. If you're enjoying the video, maybe consider subscribing today. It does help the channel and is much appreciated, and it does help also fight the YouTube algorithm. Alright, enough selling out, let's get back to the video. So we've already talked about Felminster's Helm and its scenarios. Let's talk about a few others. Lumina is one of those cases where it can come in really clutch for you in big moments, such as like a day 1 raid race, where you're severely underleveled, or maybe you're doing a specific challenge and damage is very tight and you need that extra push of damage. Lumina comes in handy because it doesn't take up a heavy slot, and you're still able to run things like legendary rockets, for example, which are some of the most powerful weapons in the game. And it's very easy to set up. You may have noticed also that Lumina is already a straight-up higher buff than Well of Radiance, and that is true. It would take priority in that department. However, keep in mind that Well can still be used to keep your team safe in encounters like Master Iryut, where there are 20 barrier champions shooting at you all at once. Moving along, Foe Tracer is another interesting choice. Foe Tracer allows you to get past that Tier 3 Surge mod barrier and move to Tier 4 instead for some extra damage. It can also be used mid-combo with other exotics. For example, you can use Star Eater Scales on Arc Hunter, get X4 Feast, then activate your super, and then hot swap to Foe Tracer to get bonus damage on your heavy weapon for 25% rather than 22% with normal surges. No backup plans are probably my favorite in this situational category. No backup plans benefit greatly from having to fight close range or melee based bosses because it allows you to utilize something like Legend of Acreus, which hits like an absolute truck. This lets you use Acreus, which gives itself a 35% damage buff thanks to Trench Barrel. Then you combine it with the 35% buff you get from having an Overshield while using no backup plans, and you'll be hitting lottery numbers with Acreus every shot. Alright, at the risk of not having this be an hour-long video, we'll cut it off there. I hope you've enjoyed this rabbit hole of numbers and maybe even learned something new today. Feel free to ask any questions if you have any, and as always, if you'd like to support the channel, consider subscribing today and or leaving a like and comment on the video. If you can't think of a comment to leave, just leave buff or debuff as a comment. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.